The night Vinterhold burned, every warrior fled, but one woman ran deeper into the flames. While raiders of the burned claw tore through the keep, slaughtering guards and silencing elders, Signe, an Omega healer listed at the very bottom of the pack registry, descended alone into the vault. What she did next defied every law of wolf biology. She swallowed the Bloodstone, a relic holding 600 years of bloodline memory, knowing it should have burned through her body within seconds. Then a scarred, battle-hardened king stepped through the smoke, looked at this nameless woman glowing with ancient silver light, and said a single word that changed everything. Why would the most powerful alpha in the north claim an Omega no one had ever bothered to see? Drop your thoughts in the comments. What do you think happens next? The relic was cold going down, not the cold of winter river water or iron left in snow. Something older, something that did not belong inside a human body. Signe pressed her fist against her sternum and breathed through it, kneeling on the stone floor of the apothecary vault, while above her, boots were splintering doors, and men were screaming in a language she did not fully understand. The Bloodstone. The Bloodstone of Vinterhold. She had swallowed it. The decision had taken less than a heartbeat. The raiders of the burned claw had been searching the keep's upper halls when she heard the first crash, the outer gate, then the guard's tower, then the terrible silence where Elder Bjarne's voice used to be. She had taken the stone from its iron cradle with both hands, felt the pulse of it like a second heartbeat buried inside the amber and silver sphere, and made the only choice that seemed right. The stone cannot fall to them. Whatever happens to me, the stone cannot fall. Now she sat in the dark, beneath the floorboards of Vinterhold's apothecary hall, listening to the world above unravel, and the Bloodstone pulsed inside her like a small, insistent sun. Once, twice. Each throb sent a thread of silver light through the thin skin of her forearms, luminous veins that flared and faded like fireflies dying in cold air. Signe Ashvale was 22 years old, and until 6 minutes ago, she had been nobody worth fearing. The Vinterhold pack registry listed her name in a careful, apologetic script near the bottom of the Omega column. She had never shifted. She had presented at 13, a quiet, unremarkable presentation, the elders said, nothing like the electric storm of a warrior's first emergence. Her mother had died that same winter of the river fever. Her father's name was a blank space that no one had ever seen fit to fill. For 9 years, she had sorted herbs and ground medicines in the apothecary of healer Astrid, sleeping on a narrow cot in the alcove behind the drying racks, where the bundles of thyme and yarrow brushed her face in the night wind. She had learned to make fever tinctures that took effect in 8 minutes. She had learned to set a bone with one hand and hold a torch with the other. She had learned the particular art of making herself small enough that large, angry people looked through her rather than at her. What she had never told anyone, not Astrid, not the pack elders, not the girl she had once, briefly, called a friend, before the girl married a Gamma and moved to the southern longhouses, was that she could feel the Bloodstone. She had felt it since childhood. A low hum that lived in the roots of her teeth when she passed the stone's sealed vault. She had assumed it was something wrong with her. Omegas who heard things that weren't there got sent east, to the healing houses that were less about healing and more about forgetting. She had kept the hum to herself, like a stone in a closed fist. Now the hum was inside her body. The vault door above exploded inward, not opened. Exploded. The iron hinges tore free from centuries-old stonework, and the heavy door crashed down the spiral stairs like a felled tree, the impact rattling the shelves of glass, sending 3 years' worth of Astrid's elderberry tincture shattering across the floor in a wine-dark flood. Signe pressed herself into the corner between the wolfsbane shelf and the cold stone wall. Her hand was braced over her abdomen, where the Bloodstone pulsed in rhythm with her racing heart. A shadow filled the doorway. No, not a shadow, a shape. The shape of a man so large the doorframe could not contain him sideways, and so he entered straight, ducking the lintel, descending the stairs with the particular deliberateness of someone who has never needed to hurry because the world has always waited for him. He was not one of the burned claw raiders. She knew that before she could see his face. The raiders had been noise and cruelty and the reek of cheap mead. This was something different. This was the silence that precedes the avalanche. He reached the bottom of the stairs and stopped. The burning light from above caught him then. Fire from somewhere outside, throwing orange across the vault. And Signe forgot to draw breath. His face was not beautiful. It was severe. All sharp planes and heavy jaw. A nose that had been broken at least twice and reset imperfectly. A scar that bisected his right brow and ended at the cheekbone, like a blade stroke long healed over. His hair was black, the black of a winter sky with no stars, cut close at the sides. He wore leather and iron, with the crest she recognized from Astrid's history scrolls, hammered into the breastplate. A wolf's head with open jaws, set before a crescent moon. The Iron Wolf Throne's crest. His eyes, when they found her in the dark, were the color of storm-gray iron. And then something happened to those eyes. His nostrils flared, once, slowly, and his pupils went wide, swallowing the gray to two thin rings around wells of absolute black. A sound came from his chest, not a growl, something lower, something that made the glass jars on the shelves vibrate. He had not spoken, he had not moved, and yet the word filled the vault like a winter storm fills a valley. Mine. Then the Bloodstone detonated. Not pulsed. Detonated. Silver light erupted from beneath Signe's hand, painting the vault walls in spiraling glyphs. Old runes, older than the Vinterhold territory, older than the pack system itself. The light was so intense it rendered her skin translucent. She could see the architecture of her own ribs, and nested against her stomach lining, blazing like a captive star, the Bloodstone. The man went absolutely still. In the burning light, she could see his expression shift, the severity of it cracking open to reveal something underneath that looked almost like wonder, and something beneath the wonder that looked almost like fear. "Who are you?" His voice was low, rough as bark, as boot heel on gravel. Signe's answer came automatically, the answer she had given for 9 years to every person with authority who had ever pointed their attention at her. "No one," she said. "I am no one." He moved. 2 strides covered what should have been 5, and he crouched in front of her so that his eyes were level with hers, and the firelit air between them compressed to something dense and warm. This close she could smell him, pine resin, iron, wood smoke, and underneath it all something animal and particular that made the base of her skull tingle with a sensation she had no name for. Something deep inside her chest moved, like a sleeping thing, disturbed, like a door, long sealed, shifting on its hinge. His hand rose toward her face. She flinched. He stopped. His fingers, scarred at every knuckle, calloused in the way of men who have spent decades holding weapons, hovered an inch from the scar on her left cheek. The scar that ran from her temple to her jaw. The scar that healer Astrid had once pressed her lips together over and said nothing about, because there were some truths that could only be held in silence. Something moved through the Alpha's expression that had nothing to do with the political situation. "Who did this to you?" Not a question, a verdict, waiting for a name. "It does not matter," Signe said. "It matters to me." He said it the way a man states a mathematical fact, the way a man says the tide will come or the frost will kill the barley. The Bloodstone pulsed between them. She felt his reaction in her own body, a full shudder that ran through his enormous frame, his breath catching, his iron eyes losing some of their coldness to something brighter and more dangerous. His fingers completed the distance. The tips of them touched her scar, feather gentle, and the contact sent warmth racing through her blood, as if she had stepped from a snowstorm into a hall with a roaring fire. She had been cold for 9 years. She had not realized until this moment how cold she had been. "That light," he said, his gaze dropping to her abdomen, where the Bloodstone's glow pulsed through her linen shift. That is the Vinterhold Bloodstone. Yes. You swallowed it. Yes. He looked at her for 3 long seconds. In the firelight, his eyes had shifted. Still gray, but warmer. Like iron heated at the forge, not yet fully molten. It should have burned through you, he said. An Omega's body cannot sustain the Bloodstone's resonance. I know. Then why? Signe met his gaze, which she had not done with anyone important since she was 15, and it had cost her. Because the stone holds 600 years of Vinterhold bloodline memory, 12,000 lives. It was worth more than me. Something crossed his face. His jaw tightened, the muscle working once, twice. When he spoke again, his voice had dropped to a register that she felt in the hollow of her chest. Nothing, he said, is worth more than you. She did not understand what he meant, not then. She was cold and frightened, and the most powerful alpha in the Northern Territories was crouching in an apothecary vault that smelled like elderberry wine and mice, looking at her as though she were the answer to a question he had carried for years without knowing it. From above, "My king, the burned claw have been neutralized. 31 captured. 6 fled into the forest. Pack Elder Bjarne is requesting your presence." The alpha did not look away from her. "Tell them to wait." A pause. Then, carefully, "My king." I said wait. The silence that followed was the silence of an entire world adjusting its expectations. Then Boots retreated. The alpha unclasped his heavy fur-lined traveling cloak and draped it over her shoulders in one efficient motion. It smelled like him. It was warm from his body. It weighed more than her pride. "Can you stand?" "I think so." He helped her up. When her legs trembled and the Bloodstone shifted inside her and she gasped, his hand was already at her elbow, steadying, certain, as if catching her was something he had been practicing without knowing it. His name, she would learn in the hour that followed, was Eirik Vargheim, Alpha King of the Iron Wolf throne, 29 years old, undefeated in battle. Unmarked, no mate, no claiming bond. A fact that had been the subject of speculation across every pack council in the north for 3 years. He stood beside her in the smoking wreckage of Vinterhold's courtyard and told the assembled wolves, in a voice that left no room for misunderstanding, that she had saved the Bloodstone while their sentries slept and their warriors sheltered, and that anyone who had opinions about her rank or her scar could share them with him directly. No one shared their opinions directly. Healer Astrid was alive. Signe learned this from one of Eirik's field medics, a young man with blood on his sleeves and a kind face, before she had finished asking. Astrid had been found in the temple, her wrist fractured, her lips split, her gray eyes blazing with the particular fury of a woman who was alive and intending to stay that way. The apothecary's examination room had survived intact. Astrid directed everything from the examination table with a splinted wrist and the authority of someone who had survived 30 years of Vinterhold winters by sheer force of competence. When she saw Signe in the doorway, wrapped in a fur cloak 3 sizes too large, silver light flickering through her linen shift, her expression shattered and rebuilt in the span of one breath. "You impossible child." She crossed the room and held Signe with her good arm, smelling of yarrow and pine tar and the familiar wool of her healer's robe. "You impossible child." "The stone is still intact," Signe said into her shoulder. Astrid pulled back and looked at her, truly looked, the way she only did when she was frightened and refusing to show it. Then her gaze moved past Signe to the doorway, where Eirik Vargheim stood with the stillness of a man who had decided he would occupy that threshold for as long as was required. Astrid's examination was thorough and silent. Her fingers mapped Signe's abdomen with expert care. When she stopped moving, her brow furrowed in a way Signe had never seen before. Not the frown of medical concern, but something older, something closer to awe. "The stone is stable," Astrid said slowly. "That is impossible," Signe said. "You said any Omega who—" "I know what I said." Astrid's hand pressed gently. "The stone is not rejecting your tissue, Signe. It is integrating with it." She swallowed. bonding, the way it would only bond with a direct descendant of the Vinterhold founding bloodline. The room went quiet. Astrid. Signe's voice came out smaller than she wanted it to. The healer closed her eyes. When she opened them, the fear was still there, but mixed now with the look of someone setting down a burden carried past endurance. Your mother's name was not Silja Ashvale, she said. It was Silja Monakirna. She was the last surviving daughter of the Vinterhold Alpha line. The true line. A pause. Not Jarl Edvard's family, who took the seat by force 28 years ago. Silja was the rightful alpha heir. The Bloodstone did not pulse. It erupted. Silver light flooded the examination room like water breaking through ice, and the runes that appeared on the walls, spiraling across stone and timber alike, were the same old script that no living scholar could fully read, but that every wolf in the room could feel settling into their bones like a truth too deep to deny. Signe arched off the examination table. The pain was not the burn of swallowing. It was structural. Her bones rewriting themselves. Her blood learning a new grammar. Something inside her chest that she had believed was absence, that she had been told was absence, slammed against its cage with a force that knocked the breath from her lungs. She heard herself scream. And then hands were on her shoulders, pressing her down, and she heard a voice saying her name in a low, wrecked register that had nothing to do with authority and everything to do with terror. Signe, look at me. She could not. The light was too bright. The weight of 12,000 lives was pouring through the Bloodstone into her blood. Birth memories and death memories and everything between. Centuries of Vinterhold compressed into a torrent that had no banks. Then she felt it. His heartbeat. Steady. Immovable. The same rhythm the stone had synchronized to in the vault below. She grabbed it like a rope in a current, pulled herself along it, hand over hand, until the light dimmed and the pain became distance, and she was lying on the examination table, looking up into the face of the Alpha King of the Iron Wolf throne, who was looking at her like she was something he had never expected to find and could not imagine losing. There you are, he said, very quietly. Astrid held up a small mirror with trembling hands. Signe's eyes, muddy brown her entire life, the color of riverbank mud, nothing significant, had changed. They were silver, pure silver, shot through with threads of gold like moonlight caught inside amber. Monacherna, Eirik said, the old word, moonblood. His voice held the weight of a man watching a legend become flesh. His hand was still on her shoulder. He showed no intention of moving it. Word spread through Vinterhold the way winter comes to the high passes, faster than anyone expected, more thorough than anyone wanted. Within the hour, every wolf in the pack knew. The herb sorter with the scar and the Omega registry and the supply closet cot was not Omega at all. The Bloodstone had recognized her. Her eyes had turned silver. The Alpha King had not left her side. Jarl Edvard arrived at the apothecary with 6 of his household warriors. He was a heavy-set man in his middle 50s, whose face had the careful blankness of someone who had spent decades performing calm over a foundation of calculation. His eyes, when they found Signe, did something she had never expected to see from the man who had publicly erased her name from the legitimate pack registry at age 11. They turned afraid. Alpha Vargheim. The Jarl's voice was steady. The Bloodstone must be extracted and secured. Healer Astrid will examine her patient, Eirik said, when the patient is stable. He was seated beside the examination table in a chair too small for him, his long legs stretched out, one hand resting on the table surface close to Signe's hand, not touching, close enough to feel warmth. Everything else waits. Edvard's eyes moved to Signe's abdomen, where the Bloodstone's glow still pulsed faintly through her linen shift. She is not equipped to carry it. An Omega, she carried it through a raid that your sentries failed to prevent, Eirik said. His voice was mild, in the way that a drawn blade is mild before it moves. And she is not Omega. With respect, my king, the stone's resonance with her could be an anomaly. The Manashirna line is extinct. We confirmed it 28 years ago. The silence that followed was very precise. Eirik looked at Edvard, and something in his expression, not anger, not threat, but a flat, clear attention, made two of the Jarl's warriors step back without being told to. "Did you confirm it?" Eirik said. "Or did your father make it so?" Edvard opened his mouth, closed it. Signe. It was the first time Edvard had said her name. In 11 years of sharing a pack, he had not once said her name in her presence. She had been the girl, or the Omega, or, at his most direct, no concern of mine. Now he said it as though it cost him something. She looked at him. "Your mother could do something," he said. His voice had lost its Jarl performance. What was left beneath it was exhausted and honest and old. Walk into a hall and every wolf in the room would lower their head, not from fear, from recognition, as if their wolves simply knew, the way birds know south. A pause. She did not even try. It was simply what she was. The room waited. "My father killed her," Edvard said. Flat, final, as if the words had been stored so long that removing them left nothing behind but relief. "Because he could not rule a territory that contained a wolf who commanded by existence. He put me on the seat and told me to hold it. I have held it 28 years. He looked at her directly. "I am telling you this, not for my sake. I am telling you so that you understand what you are before you become it." He looked then at Eirik. "She is not only your mate, she is a Manashirna, a moonblood alpha who can command any wolf within her territory by will alone." His jaw tightened. "Including yours." Eirik's expression did not change. "I know. And that does not concern you." "No." Edvard studied him for a long moment. Then he exhaled, a long, controlled breath, and did something that surprised everyone, including himself. He turned and left, his warriors filing out behind him, and the door shut quietly. Eirik looked back at Signe. She had not moved. She was sitting on the examination table, with her hand over her abdomen, and her silver-gold eyes very steady and very wide. "Did you know?" she asked. "In the vault, before any of this." "I knew what you were to me," he said. "Not what you were to the pack." He looked at the middle distance for a moment, the muscle in his jaw working. "My wolf has been unsettled for 3 days, since we crossed into Vinterhold territory. I could not explain it. The moment I entered that vault..." He stopped. "What?" she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then, "The moment I entered that vault, my wolf stopped being unsettled." The Bloodstone pulsed once, warmly, in the silence between them. The journey to the Iron Wolf throne seat, Vargheim's stronghold, 4 hours north, through pine forest so old the canopy blocked the stars, was made in a military convoy that moved with the unhurried precision of a force that had nothing to prove. Signe rode with Astrid in a covered cart lined with furs, the healer's splinted wrist resting in her lap, her eyes moving between the dark shapes of trees, and the two of them spoke, finally, of everything that had not been speakable before. "Her eyes," Astrid said quietly. "Your mother's. I never told you. They were silver, just the same, when she was frightened or fiercely happy. Most of the time she kept them ordinary. She knew how to dim them." She pressed her lips together. "I taught you to dim yours before you knew you had them to dim." "The wolf," Signe said. "You bound it." "I bound it. A gradual thing, gentle as I could make it. Done in stages over your first 3 years. You would not remember." Astrid's voice was careful. "If your wolf had manifested in Vinterhold territory, under Edvard's rule, I know." Signe did know. She understood it with a clarity that was not bitterness. The emotion was too complicated for bitterness. More like looking at a map of the journey you had made and understanding, for the first time, all the roads you had not been allowed to take. You saved my life. You saved mine when you were 4 years old, Astrid said, and grabbed my hand before I walked off the apothecary roof in a fever dream. So I think the ledger is more complicated than that. Signe almost laughed. The night outside smelled like pine and coming snow. She was looking out the cart's window when Vargheim's stronghold came into view on the ridge ahead, and the sight stole her breath entirely. It was not a castle from the southern stories, towers and pennants and drawbridges over decorative moats. It was older and more serious than that, a fortress carved from the living rock of the mountain, its walls the same gray stone as the cliff face they emerged from, as if the mountain had grown them. Firelight burned in 100 windows. A waterfall carved a white line down the eastern face and vanished into the dark below. The surrounding forest had been cleared into a wide expanse. Practical, she understood, the calculation of a man who built things to last. The convoy entered through a passage carved through the mountain's base. Inside, the stronghold smelled like stone and torch smoke, and the particular layered warmth of many hearth fires burning in deep-walled rooms. Eirik was waiting at the bottom of the convoy ramp. He had arrived ahead of them. She had seen him running alongside the convoy for the first half hour, in wolf form, a shape of darkness against the paler dark of the pines. He had shifted back at some point before they arrived, and stood now, wearing only a simple tunic and trousers, his armor set aside, the map of his body visible in the torch-lit entry corridor. Signe had not been prepared for the scars. Not one scar, not two, dozens, layered across his arms and torso. Claw marks, blade marks, the deep puckered circle of an old wound beneath his left collarbone that had required stitching by someone who had done their best with the materials available. His body was not the body of a man who had been protected. It was the body of a man who had chosen to stand between danger and other people so many times that the danger had begun to accumulate on his skin. She looked away. She was not sure why. The looking felt like something too personal. "Your rooms are ready," he said, addressing both of them, but with his eyes on Signe in a way that was becoming familiar, that quality of attention, total and unguarded, that made her feel like the only solid object in the room. The rooms were in the residential wing, adjacent chambers connected by a shared sitting room, where a fire was already burning. The furniture was dark wood and good iron, built for cold winters. The bed was enormous and real linen sheeted and smelled like cedar. Signe stood in the center of the bedroom and pressed her hand to her abdomen, feeling the Bloodstone pulse in its steady rhythm, and realized she had not been alone, truly alone, in silence, without someone else's emergency pressing on her, in 6 hours. She sat on the edge of the bed and breathed. Through the stone walls and the distance between them, she could feel the faint warm thread of his heartbeat, which the Bloodstone was synchronized to, which meant she was aware of him at all times, in the way she was aware of the fire across the room, not obtrusively, but present. "I can feel you," she whispered to the empty air. She was not sure if that terrified her or not. The next 3 days remade her in ways she could not have anticipated. Astrid ran tests, lunar resonance readings, the old blood rite diagnostics, the chalk circle rituals that required burning specific combinations of herbs in specific sequences. The results were consistent and extraordinary. Signe was full-blooded Monachana. Her wolf, the wolf she had been told did not exist, the wolf she had explained away her entire life as absence, was a lunar alpha, a classification so rare it had been listed as extinct by the Northern Councils for over a century. Eirik's war council convened on the second day. Signe sat in the corner of the war room with no particular expectation of being consulted, watching the Alpha King operate in his native environment. Maps spread across a long table, advisors arrayed around it, every voice given space to speak, but Eirik's voice carrying the particular quality of finality. His chief strategist was a woman called Ragnhild, gray-haired and sharp-jawed, with an iron prosthetic hand that she used as a pointer when she wanted emphasis. His chancellor, a lean man named Sigmund, who smelled like old parchment, argued for secrecy. Ragnhild argued for immediate alliance declaration.
A monarchian heir bonded to the Iron Throne, Ragnhild said, her iron hand tapping the map,
is either the end of territorial conflict or the beginning of the worst war in 3 generations. Concealing it buys us 2 weeks before the scouts report anyway. Announcing it invites every frightened Alpha Council in the north to unite against us preemptively, Sigmund countered, polishing his spectacles. Fear of consolidated power is more galvanizing than ambition. Eirik let them argue. He was very still at the head of the table, one hand resting on the map surface, his gray eyes moving between them. Then his gaze moved to the corner where Signe sat. "What do you think?" The room stopped. Ragnhild and Sigmund exchanged a look. Signe's first instinct, the 9-year habit of making herself invisible, rose in her throat like a tide. She felt it, recognized it, and made a choice. The Bloodstone pulsed. "Secrecy won't hold," she said. Her voice sounded steadier than she felt. "Edvard's people saw my eyes change. By now, every pack within 2 days' ride has heard a version of what happened." She paused. "And a secret implies shame. Or fear." She met Eirik's eyes. "Are we afraid?" The room was silent. "No," Eirik said. "We are not afraid." The declaration went out that evening, formal, unambiguous. The Alpha King had found his fated mate. She was Mona Kärna. She was under his protection. Any challenge would be treated as a declaration of war against the Iron Throne. 3 territories sent congratulations within the hour. 2 sent silence. And the territory to the east, the Ashfall Dominion, ruled by Alpha Conrad, who had been consolidating power on Vinterhold's eastern border for 2 years, sent a single messenger with a single question. Is she truly Mona Kärna, or a fabrication to legitimize your expansion? The messenger was a young woman with red hair and a composure that Signe respected. She delivered her lord's challenge in the Great Hall without flinching. Eirik told her, "If your lord doubts this, he is welcome to come and see for himself. If he doubts my word, he is welcome to say so to my face." The messenger left quickly. She could not sleep. The Bloodstone was restless, pulsing in arrhythmic patterns that she had come to recognize as precursor to something building, some threshold approaching. She lay in the enormous cedar-scented bed and stared at the ceiling, and felt the pressure of it, like the held breath before a storm. After an hour, she gave up and walked. The stronghold at midnight was not empty. Guards moved through the corridors with the quiet efficiency of a military household. A kitchen fire burned somewhere below. Distantly, someone was sharpening a blade in long, meditative strokes. She moved through it in bare feet, following the Bloodstone's pull, which did not lead her down toward the safe rooms as common sense suggested it should. It led her down 2 flights of stone stairs, through a door that opened at her touch, into a room she had not known existed. The library. High stone walls lined with shelves of scrolls and bound volumes, half of them older than the stronghold itself. A fireplace with dying coals. A single leather chair drawn close to the last of the warmth. And in the chair, a man. Eirik. He was reading by firelight, wearing loose trousers and nothing else, a book across his knees that looked old enough to be an ancestor's property. He looked up when she entered and did not seem surprised, as if he had been, on some low level, waiting. "Can you feel it too?" she said. "The pressure." "Since afternoon." He set the book aside. "Sit." She sat in the second chair, across the cooling fire. The coals between them glowed orange and red, the same muted pulse as the Bloodstone. Outside, the mountain wind spoke in low vowels against the stone. "I am afraid," she said. She had not planned to say it. It came out because it was true, and because she was tired of holding truths at arm's length. "Not of you. Not of the other packs. of myself, of what happens when Astrid finishes unbinding my wolf and I become— She stopped. Whatever I am supposed to become. He was quiet for a moment. Then he leaned forward, elbows on his knees, firelight making copper of his scars. When I was 19, he said, I fought my first command battle. Not the first time I drew blood. I had done that at 16, which is a different story. This was the first time men died because of my orders, not my hands. 40 men. We won. We won clearly. His voice was level. And I went into the forest afterward and could not speak for an hour because I did not know how to be someone who could make that decision and live with it. She was watching him. He was not looking at her, looking at the coals, at the specific spot where a man looks when he is choosing how much of himself to put into words. What did you do? She asked. I came back, he said, and I made the next decision. And the one after that. And eventually, the decisions were made by someone who was still me, but had learned how to carry the weight without confusing the weight for who he was. A pause. The fire shifted, a coal settling. You will be afraid, he said. That is the correct response to power you did not ask for, but you do not carry it alone. Signe looked at him, this man with his map of old wounds and his gray eyes warmed by firelight, and felt something in her chest open like a window. Show me, she said, and she did not entirely know what she was asking. He stood, extended his hand. She took it. His fingers closed around hers, warm, calloused, certain. And he led her through the library to a door she had not noticed, set flush with the bookshelves, which opened onto a stone balcony that jutted from the mountainside into the dark. The valley spread below them, silver blue under a moon 3 nights from full. Forest and frozen river, and the distant pinpoints of pack longhouse fires. All of it breathing under a sky crowded with stars. He stood behind her, close enough that she could feel his warmth against her shoulders, and his hands came to rest there lightly, fingertips pressing into the tight muscle at the base of her neck, a touch too practical to be tender, but too attentive to be merely functional. Close your eyes, he said. His breath was warm near her temple. Find the Bloodstone. Find its frequency. She closed her eyes. The Bloodstone was there, a warm, steady sun in her belly. She focused on it, and the world narrowed to that point of light. And then the light expanded, outward, through her body, through the stone beneath her feet, through the mountain air. She felt them, every wolf in the valley below. Not their thoughts, their heartbeats. Hundreds of them, distinct as individual instruments, each one different in tempo and weight and quality. She could feel the sleeping ones and the restless ones, and one, far below, who was pacing. A mother, perhaps, with a sick child. Oh, she breathed. What do you feel? His voice was low. Everyone. His hands tightened on her shoulders, not painfully. A different kind of pressure. Something that recognized what she had just said, without having words for its response. Then, below in the valley, a wolf howled. One voice, long and searching. Then another. Then dozens, cascading. Voices rising to the moon in a sound that was very old and very certain. They feel you, Eirik said, rough. The stone carries you to them. She opened her eyes. The valley was silver with sound, and the moon hung over the mountain's shoulder like a watching eye. And Signe, who had been invisible for 22 years, felt herself seen. Not by one person's eyes, but by hundreds of hearts, all of them resonating with the stone she carried. She turned and found his face closer than she had expected. The firelight from the room behind them caught the edge of his jaw and the scar through his brow. His eyes, in the moonlight, had shifted color. Not cold iron anymore. Something with more warmth in it. Something he was not, she suspected, accustomed to wearing on his face. Neither of them moved. The moment stretched, fine and bright as wire, until the wind came off the mountain and she shivered, and he stepped back, and the wire broke without sound. "You should rest," he said. "The unbinding continues tomorrow." "I know." She turned back toward the door, then stopped. "Eirik." He waited. "In the vault," she said. "Before the Bloodstone reacted, before any of it, you called me yours." She was not looking at him. I heard it. A beat of silence. "I know," he said. She nodded once and went inside. The Ashfall Dominion attacked 6 days later. Not at night. At the hour before dawn, the gray hour between the last watch and the first, the vulnerability window that only a military mind with intimate knowledge of fortress rhythms would know to exploit. The first explosion hit the eastern watchtower. Signe was in the apothecary annex with Astrid, midway through the morning's unbinding session, when the stone beneath their feet trembled and the high shelves swayed, and the alarm system, a cascade of iron bells through the stronghold's corridors, began its war voice. "Safe room," Astrid said immediately. "Now, Signe." But the Bloodstone was screaming. Not pain, urgency. Each pulse a direction, a sense of position. She could feel the attackers like she had felt the valley wolves that night on the balcony, but these were different. Tight, controlled, and moving in formation. 43 wolves breaching the eastern approach. 14 circling north. And something else. 12 shapes that moved with human smoothness and through no wolf resonance, surrounded by a field of cold nullification that made the Bloodstone flinch every time the field shifted. "There is something with them," she said. "Something that blocks the wolf sense." "Go," Astrid said. Signe went. Not toward the safe rooms. She ran up. The battle on the eastern ridge was not like anything she had imagined. She had imagined, on the few occasions she had imagined, something ordered, 2 forces meeting along a defined line. This was mud and fire and individual struggles overlapping, a chaos that had its own logic, if you could see from high enough. She could see from high enough. The Bloodstone gave her altitude she didn't have. She stood on the upper rampart and felt the entire engagement like a map drawn in heartbeats. And there, behind the main assault force, the 12 nullification mages in their dark wool cloaks, their field expanding outward, every iron-thrown wolf within its radius stumbling, their shifts faltering, their strength halving. "Wolfsbanecraft," said Ragnhild, appearing at her shoulder, her iron hand replaced with a curved blade attachment. "Conrad hired human mages, nullifiers. If they reach the inner gate, we lose the shifted forms entirely." A pause. "The only counter to their working is lunar resonance. Raw lunar. Like the Bloodstone. Like the Bloodstone." Ragnhild looked at her directly. The look was not a request. It was an assessment. "The unbinding is not complete." "No." "Can you control what emerges?" Signe considered this honestly. "I don't know." "Then go," Ragnhild said, "and find out." Below, through the smoke and shouting, she caught a glimpse of Eirik in the thickened form of his alpha's half-shift, moving through 3 opponents simultaneously, with the devastating economy of a man who had been doing this for a decade, a black shape in the orange light. She felt his awareness of her across the engagement before she had taken 5 steps. His head snapped toward the rampart. A howl rose from his chest. Not a war cry, something else. Something that said, "Stay back," in the oldest language wolves had. She pushed her intent toward him through the bond they had not yet named. "No, trust me. Fight." A held breath through the bond. Then his attention refocused. She ran. The nullification field hit her at the base of the eastern slope, and she went to one knee in the mud, her vision going white-gray, the Bloodstone guttering for the first time since she had swallowed it. Her muscles locked, her breath stopped. And then the wolf woke up. Not slowly, not the gradual, managed emergence Astrid had been coaxing for 6 days. A catastrophic awakening, the wolf throwing itself against 22 years of binding with the Bloodstone as accomplice, and the wall that had contained it shattered not from the outside, but from the inside. The world became everything. Every smell separated itself. Pine and snow and torch oil, and the sharp chemical tang of the magecraft, and beneath it all the blood iron of Eirik's fighting 30 feet away, which her wolf identified without effort. Sound split into layers. She could hear individual heartbeats through the noise. Silver light tore from her kneeling body in a sphere that expanded outward, with a sound she felt rather than heard. A low, resonant boom of pure lunar energy meeting the nullification field. The field shattered. Both fields. All 12 of them. The mages staggered. 2 fell. Every Iron Throne wolf in range felt their power flood back, like blood returning to a numbed limb. The lead mage turned toward her. An old man she saw, weather-worn and deeply frightened, his hood back, his eyes white-ringed. He looked at her the way people had looked at her before she had learned to make herself invisible. Only now he was afraid of what he saw. The Bloodstone answered for her, a final pulse, directive, complete, and the shift took her. It was not graceful. She had not expected grace. Her bones cracked and reformed in a cascade that felt like being struck by lightning from the inside. She heard herself cry out, and the cry became something else entirely, rising in pitch and changing in quality until it was not a human sound at all. Her wolf was white, the color of fresh snow, the color of moonlight on still water. Large, not as large as Eirik's war form, but close, with silver moon eyes and light that poured from her fur as if she had been woven from it. The mages fled. The Ashfall wolves, seeing the silver wolf standing at the center of a collapsed nullification field with the Alpha King at her side, broke formation. The retreat became a rout. She shifted back in the mud as the sun cleared the mountain. She was on her hands and knees, shaking, naked, the Bloodstone pulsing weakly in her abdomen. Not the strong beat of before, but the beat of something that had spent itself and was finding its way back. Her muscles fired in random arcs. She could taste iron in her mouth from having bitten the inside of her cheek during the shift. Then, Eirik was there. He shifted back beside her and wrapped his arms around her, and she felt the full shock of how badly he was trembling. His entire frame, controlled through every second of the battle, now shaking in a way he apparently could not help. She pressed her face into his neck and breathed him in. Pine and smoke and iron, and something beneath all of that which was only him. His heartbeat, beneath her cheek, was the same rhythm the Bloodstone was trying to match. "You terrified me," he said. His voice was destroyed, rough and cracked, like stone split by winter frost. "I know. Never again." She pulled back to look at him. He was covered in ash and the dried evidence of other men's injuries, and there was a cut across his ribs that had already half healed, and his gray eyes were not gray at all in this light. They were burning, wolf close to the surface, something he was clearly working to contain. "You cannot ask me that," she said, quietly, but without apology. "You said you would teach me what I am. This is what I am." She held his gaze. "You cannot ask me to be less of it because it frightens you." His jaw worked. She watched the struggle behind his eyes, the part of him that had spent a decade making the world safe by controlling its variables, meeting something it could not reduce to a variable. Then he rested his forehead against hers, his eyes closed. His breath against her lips was unsteady. "Then I will be beside you," he said. "Every time. Do you understand? Every time." She put her hand against his chest and felt his heartbeat against her palm. The Bloodstone found it immediately, locked to it, settled. "Okay," she said. The claiming ceremony was held 3 nights after the battle, under a moon so full it cast shadows. The stronghold's north clearing served as the ceremony ground, a bowl of earth ringed by ancient pines, their bark silver-gray in the moonlight, their roots so deep they had been standing before the first pack in the north was founded. The flat granite altar at the clearing's center had witnessed 100 such ceremonies, and the stone was worn smooth at its edges by the passage of all those witnessed lives. The Iron Throne pack assembled in their hundreds. Signe stood at the tree line in a white dress of her own choosing, simple wool, unembroidered, nothing that would look wrong on her body. She had turned down 3 other options. She did not want to wear borrowed grandeur. She wanted to arrive as herself. Astrid stood near the front of the circle, her splinted wrist held carefully, her eyes already bright. Ragnhild stood at attention in formal dress, the iron prosthetic polished to a mirror finish. Sigmund held his peppermint tea and looked like a man trying not to cry in public. And at the edge of the circle, alone, without his household warriors, wearing plain traveling clothes, Edvard. The Jarl of Vinterhold met her eyes when she found him. He held the gaze for 1 beat, 2, and then lowered his head. Not a bow, something older than a bow, a recognition. She walked to the altar on bare feet, and the pine needles were cold and real beneath her, and the Bloodstone pulsed with the rhythm of the moon. Eirik waited at the altar. He wore black, because he was Eirik, and wearing anything else would have looked like theater. His expression, in the moonlight, was open in a way she had only seen twice before. Once in the library by the dying fire, and once in the mud after the battle, trembling against her. The mask of the Alpha King was absent. The conqueror was absent. He was just the man who had come down the vault stairs and looked at her like the answer to a question he had been asking since he was old enough to ask. She reached him. The elder who conducted the ceremony was very old, her voice thin but steady, her eyes still sharp, and she spoke the old words in the Monacherna tongue, which Signe did not know with her mind, but knew with her blood. The Bloodstone translating it directly into her pulse. Do you know this wolf? Do you accept this bond? Do you give your heartbeat to hers for all the nights the moon rises? I do, Eirik said. 2 words, carrying the full weight of a man who chose them. He tilted her head gently. His thumb rested against her jaw. She could feel his restraint, the barely contained force of it. Every line of his body concentrated into this one point of contact, this one precise and deliberate act. His breath warmed her skin. Signe, he said, very quietly, just for her. She breathed out and let the breath carry everything it needed to carry. His bite was precise and deep, and when the mate bond sealed, she felt it like a door opening. Not into a room, but into a person. Eirik poured into her awareness, 8 years of loneliness and iron discipline, and the particular exhaustion of being the strongest person in every room you entered. The grief, old and incorporated, of a father's death and a mother's departure. And beneath all of it, under the armor and the scars and the careful architecture of his self-control, a capacity for devotion so absolute it frightened him, which was why he had kept it locked in the same place she had kept her wolf. She poured into him 9 years of invisibility, the supply closet caught, and the mislabeled herbs, and the particular skill of making herself forgettable. Her mother's silver eyes, which she had dimmed her whole life without knowing why. Her fear of being seen. Her greater fear of never being seen at all. The Bloodstone erupted. Silver light rose from their joined figures and climbed the sky in a column visible for miles, spiraling upward past the pine crowns, past the mountain's shoulder, into the bowl of stars. In the clearing, wolves shifted involuntarily, unable to contain the resonance. The ancient pines groaned, as if in response to something they recognized. When the light faded, Eirik lifted his head. His eyes were gold. Not gray, not iron, pure gold. Wolf and man unified, the bond completed. Mine, he said, aloud this time. Not possession, proof. Mine to protect, mine to stand beside, mine to... the old words were not large enough for what he meant, and so he let the bond say the rest of it, and she felt every word. She raised her hand and touched the mark on her neck. It was warm.
It would be warm for the rest of her life.
Yours, she said. The pack howled, dozens of voices rising in a cascade that rolled down the mountainside and into the valley below, carrying across the frozen river and the sleeping longhouses and the pine forests that ran to the edge of the known territories. In Vinterhold, wolves stopped what they were doing and looked north. On Edvard's balcony, the old Jarl stood in the cold air and listened and let himself, for one private moment, grieve the things that could not be given back, and then let them go. The celebration lasted until the moon set. Signe stood in the clearing when most of the wolves had drifted back to the warmth of the stronghold, and she looked at what remained. Fire embers, scattered pine needles, the granite altar worn smooth by 100 ceremonies before this one. The pine needles beneath her bare feet were cold and sharp and real, the same earth that had been beneath her feet when she sorted herbs in the apothecary vault. The same earth that was beneath her feet now. The earth didn't know what had changed. It held her either way. She curled her toes into it, felt the cold, felt the Bloodstone pulse, steady and warm, synchronized with the heartbeat of the man who appeared beside her. Because he had been watching her since she turned from the altar, and he had given her a minute alone, which was more than most men would have thought to give, and exactly the right amount. He stood beside her, not touching, close enough that she could feel his warmth. "Tell me something," she said. "What?" "Tell me something you have never told anyone." He was quiet for a moment. Around them the pines stood in their patient dark, witnesses to several centuries of complicated lives. "I used to come out here," he said, "on nights when the governing was too heavy, before the stronghold had all the people it has now. I would sit on the granite and watch the valley and think about whether what I was building was worth what it cost." A pause. "I never reached an answer." "And now?" He turned to look at her. In the last of the fire glow, his eyes were warm gold. The scar through his brow, the jaw she had traced in her memory 100 times without permission. "Now," he said, "I have a different question." The Bloodstone pulsed once, quietly, between them. She looked up at him, this scarred and careful and terrifying man, who had run 15 miles through winter forest because a neighboring pack sent up a distress signal, and had found, instead of what he came for, the thing he had apparently been missing without knowing it. And she thought of the supply closet cot, and the chamomile she could identify in total darkness, and the scar no one had bothered to stitch, and the name written in the smallest possible handwriting at the bottom of the registry. She thought, I was that person, and I am still that person, and something else as well. She thought, that is all right. "What is the new question?" she asked. He looked at her for a moment, with the specific expression she had only seen on his face in private. Unguarded, stripped of architecture, holding something it rarely admitted to holding. Then he held out his hand. She took it. They stood together on the cold mountain earth while the last fire embers cooled, and the moon went down, and the valley below them breathed in its sleep, and the pine needles were real beneath their feet, and the Bloodstone was quiet and warm, and for the first time in her life, Signe Ashvale did not want to be invisible. She wanted to be here. She was. For 22 years, Signe believed she was nobody. Not because the world told her once, but because it told her every single day, in every small and deliberate way. The wrong name in the wrong column. A cot behind the drying racks. A scar no one bothered to ask about. She learned to make herself invisible, not out of weakness, but out of survival. And yet, when the doors splintered and the fire rose and every capable warrior ran, she was the one who stayed. She did not stay because she was powerful. She stayed because she believed the stone was worth more than herself. That single act of selfless courage cracked open a truth she had been denied her entire life. She was never what they told her she was. The most dangerous lie we carry is not the one others speak about us. It is the one we eventually start to believe ourselves. Signe's story is a reminder that identity cannot be erased by a registry, a rank, or a room too small to hold your name. Sometimes, the people written off in the smallest handwriting carry the oldest light. Sometimes, the ones nobody watches are the ones holding everything together. You do not have to be seen to be real. But when the moment comes, and it will come, do not shrink from it. The world does not always deserve the quiet ones, but the quiet ones show up anyway. If something in this story hit differently for you, tell me in the comments. Which moment stayed with you the longest? Your words genuinely keep this channel alive. And if you want more stories like this, subscribe and come back. There are more untold lights waiting to be seen. Epilogue: The weight of ordinary mornings. The war room had witnessed many things in its long life. Battle plans drawn and redrawn. Alliance treaties signed over cold mead. Ragnhild's iron hand slamming the table hard enough to rattle the inkwells on at least 14 separate occasions. Sigmund crying quietly into his peppermint tea when the eastern border dispute finally resolved. A moment he still denied, despite 3 witnesses. It had not, until this particular Tuesday morning, witnessed the Alpha King of the Iron Wolf throne standing completely motionless in the center of the room, holding a small, hand-knitted sock. The sock was the size of his thumb. "It is very small," Eirik said. "Yes," Signe said from the doorway. She was leaning against the frame with her arms crossed, and the particular expression she wore when she was trying very hard not to smile, and failing completely. That is generally the nature of infant socks. He turned the sock over in his scarred hands, studied it, then looked at her. "How long have you known?" 3 weeks. 3 weeks. I wanted to be certain before I... 3 weeks, Signe. Eirik. I have been sitting in meetings for 3 weeks, he said, with the careful enunciation of a man processing information at a speed his composure was not designed for. Discussing grain allocation and eastern border patrols while I was growing a person, yes. She pushed off the doorframe and crossed the room toward him. Are you angry? He looked at the sock, looked at her. Something happened to his face that she had only seen a handful of times. The full dismantling of the architecture, everything underneath it visible at once. His jaw worked. No, he said. His voice came out wrecked. No. He pulled her in with both arms, the tiny sock still in his fist, and held her with the specific force of a man who has spent his entire adult life protecting things and has just been handed the most important thing he has ever been asked to protect. She felt him shaking. Eirik, she said into his shoulder, you are trembling. I am not trembling. You are absolutely... I am experiencing a controlled physical response to significant news. She laughed. The laugh went into his neck, and she felt him exhale, long and slow, his arms tightening. Outside the war room, Ragnhild paused in the corridor, listened, and then walked very deliberately in the opposite direction with a small, private smile that she would have denied under any form of interrogation. The pregnancy changed him in ways he clearly had not anticipated and was not sure how to feel about. He became, in Ragnhild's carefully chosen words, attentive to the point of structural concern. He appeared in the apothecary annex 3 times in the first week to ask Astrid questions from a list he had written in his precise military handwriting. The list included 17 items. Item 4 was, at what ambient temperature should the sleeping room be kept? Optimal range. Item 9 was, is it normal for her to want to eat pine resin? Should I be concerned? Item 12 was, what do I do if something goes wrong? Astrid answered items 1 through 11 with patience. At item 12, she looked at him over her spectacles for a long moment and said, You call for me, and you trust that I have been doing this for 30 years. And so has her body. A pause. And you hold her hand. He held her hand. Constantly. She began to suspect he was not entirely aware he was doing it. In meetings, at dinner, walking through the stronghold corridors, his hand would find hers, with the automatic certainty of a compass finding north. You are doing it again, she told him one evening. Doing what? Holding my hand, and also reading battle reports simultaneously. He looked down at their joined hands. Considered this. Did not let go. The battle reports require only one hand, he said reasonably. She loved him so much, it was occasionally inconvenient. The cravings were a separate matter entirely. I need the black bread, she announced, at 2 in the morning in the 4th month, sitting up in bed with the focused urgency of a woman receiving military intelligence. Eirik, who had been deeply asleep, was vertical in approximately 3 seconds. Is something wrong? The black bread from the lower kitchens, with the caraway seeds, not the other bread. The specific bread. A pause, in which the Alpha King recalibrated from combat readiness to a different category of emergency. The lower kitchens, he said, are 4 floors down. Yes, it is 2 in the morning. The bread does not know what time it is. He went. He returned with the bread, an entire loaf, which he had clearly woken the night baker to produce, because no remaining bread from the evening would have satisfied the standard, and sat beside her while she ate half of it with the intensity of someone completing a mission. Thank you, she said, with her mouth full. Always, he said, which was true and not at all sarcastic, and she kissed his jaw with caraway seeds on her lips. The baby arrived on a night in early spring when the snow was melting off the mountain in thin silver rivers, and the valley below smelled like cold water and pine sap and something new beginning. It was not a smooth process. Signe had never expected it to be. But Astrid was there, and the Bloodstone pulsed a steady warmth that she used like a rope in a current, the same way she had used Eirik's heartbeat in the vault 2 years ago. Eirik remained in the room. This had not been standard practice in the Stronghold's history. This was now standard practice because he had told Astrid with quiet, absolute finality that he would be in the room. And Astrid, who had known him since he was 19 and held his father's hand at the end, had simply said, "Then wash your hands and stand where I tell you." He stood where she told him. He held Signe's hand. He said nothing for most of it, which was the correct thing to do. And at one point, she looked at his face and the expression on it, raw and terrified and wonderstruck, was the most honest thing she had ever seen on a human being. When the baby cried for the first time, Eirik made a sound she had never heard from him before. Not a word, just a sound. Low and broken and completely involuntary. The sound of something in a man's chest opening that had been closed a very long time. Astrid placed the baby in his arms. He stood very still and looked down at his daughter, dark-haired, outraged, her tiny face scrunched into a furious critique of the world she had just arrived in. And the Alpha King of the Iron Wolf throne appeared to stop functioning entirely. "Eirik," Signe said softly. "She is very small," he said. His voice had no texture left in it. "You said that about the sock, too." "She is smaller than the sock implied." "She is perfect," Astrid said firmly. Signe watched him hold their daughter. The careful immovability of him, all that scarred and disciplined strength, turned to the single purpose of being the safest place in the room, and felt the Bloodstone pulse with a warmth she had no word for. "Hello," Eirik said to the baby, quietly, as if introducing himself to someone important. "I am your father. I have been looking forward to meeting you." The baby stopped crying. She blinked up at him with unfocused, silver-gray eyes. "Oh," he said. Her name was Lilja Vargheim Monakern, because Signe had insisted on both names, and Eirik had agreed to everything approximately 30 seconds after holding her. The first months were a study in the limits of military preparedness. Eirik had read books. Many books. He had requested texts on infant development from 3 separate libraries and made notes. He had consulted Sigmund, whose sister had 4 children, and Ragnhild, who had raised 2 sons and managed them with the efficiency she applied to everything. He had believed he was prepared. He had not been prepared. "She does not stop," he said, at 3 in the morning of the 6th night, standing in the nursery with Lilia on his shoulder, swaying in the rhythmic pattern that was the only thing that worked. His eyes were the specific eyes of a man who had survived 8 years of warfare and was now discovering a new category of endurance. "I have read all the books. The books did not adequately convey the duration." "Welcome to it," Signe said from the rocking chair, feeding herself cold tea and watching him with love and exhausted amusement in equal measure. "Is this sustainable?" "Ask me in a year," he swayed. Lilia grumbled against his shoulder and then, with profound reluctance, subsided into sleep. He stood perfectly still for 30 seconds to be certain. Then he turned to Signe with the expression of a man who has successfully negotiated a particularly difficult treaty. "She is asleep," he said. "I see that. I did it. You did." The pride on his face was so complete and unguarded that she had to press her lips together to contain herself. This man, this ridiculous, wonderful, scarred man who had faced down armies and continental alliances and the full weight of the northern territories, standing in a nursery at 3 in the morning, vibrating with the achievement of getting one small person to sleep. "Come to bed," she said. He put Lilia down in the cradle with the care of someone handling irreplaceable ancient relics. Then he crossed the room and gathered Signe from the rocking chair, with the efficiency of a man who had decided this was also a mission requiring completion. "I can walk," she said. "I know." He carried her anyway. Lilia grew the way mountain spring comes, suddenly and everywhere at once. At 4 months, she discovered her father's scar and tried to eat it, which he permitted with extraordinary patience, while Signe documented the event in the journal she had started keeping. At 6 months, she pulled his hair with both fists, and he sat completely still and said, "She has a strong grip," in the tone of a man noting a positive strategic development. At 8 months, she said her first word, which was not mama or papa, but which was, unmistakably, in the clear, silver voice she had inherited along with her mother's occasional luminous eyes, "More." "More," Eirik repeated, looking at his daughter, looking at Signe. "Her first word is a command." "She gets that from you," Signe said. "She absolutely does not. You once told your entire war council to wait because you were busy looking at me." That was a different situation entirely. Lilia said more again, louder, with emphasis, reaching for the piece of black bread Signe was eating. "She also gets the bread thing from you," Eirik said. "That I will accept." What Signe watched over those months was a transformation she had not fully predicted. She had known he would be devoted. She had understood his capacity for devotion before he had fully admitted it himself. What she had not anticipated was the specific texture of it. The way he talked to Lilia constantly and seriously, narrating the war room meetings she attended on his shoulder, explaining the geography of the Northern Territories to her, using his hands over the map table while she drooled on the parchment. The way he learned every version of her cry within the first week and could identify hunger versus discomfort versus "I simply object to the current situation," with the analytical precision he applied to everything. The way he changed, specifically, in the hours he sat with Lilia alone, the pack elders waiting, the correspondence piling up, and did not appear to notice or care. "You are different," Signe told him one evening, watching him from the bedroom doorway while he sat in the nursery chair, Lilia asleep against his chest, his chin resting on the top of her dark head, his eyes on the mountain outside the window. He looked at her. How? She thought about it. Softer, she said.
Not weak, just more. She searched for it. More present than you used to be.
He was quiet for a moment.
Outside, the spring wind moved through the valley pine forest.
Before, he said, I was building towards something I could not name. Every decision, every alliance, every battle, all pointing toward a thing I believed I needed to construct. He looked at the sleeping weight on his chest. I have stopped pointing toward things.
A pause. I am simply here.
She crossed the room and sat beside him, leaning her head against his shoulder. The Bloodstone pulsed, warm and steady, finding his heartbeat the way it always did. Here, she thought. This is the answer he found to the question he stopped asking. 2 years after Lilia arrived, the stronghold had reorganized itself around her presence in ways that no one had formally decided, but everyone had accepted. The war room now had a small toy chest in the corner. This had happened incrementally, and no one was entirely sure at what point it had become permanent. Ragnhild had placed the first item, a carved wooden wolf, without comment, and then looked at anyone who looked at her until they looked elsewhere. Sigmund had learned 17 different songs. He performed them on request, with the resigned competence of a man who had discovered a skill he had not known he possessed, and was not sure how he felt about possessing. The Iron Throne guard rotation had developed, organically, a secondary function that involved ensuring Lilia did not reach the upper ramparts during her exploratory phases. The guards were deeply committed to this function. She was extremely fast. On an ordinary evening in late summer, the kind of evening that smelled like warm stone and distant cook fires, and the particular sweetness of alpine grass, Signe sat on the library balcony where Eirik had first shown her the valley, watching the light go golden over the distant river. Lilia was asleep inside after a dinner that had involved more food on the floor than in her mouth, and a battle of wills over bathwater that Eirik had lost with a dignity she found extraordinary. He appeared beside her, 2 cups of tea. He handed her one and leaned on the stone railing, looking at the valley the way he had looked at it that first night. The weight of it, all those lives and responsibilities, but differently now. Looser, as if the weight had not decreased, but had been redistributed. Tell me something, she said. The same words, their particular ritual. He smiled, the real one, the one that arrived slowly and changed the whole architecture of his face. She told the border patrol captain today that his beard was too big and needed adjustment. Signe closed her eyes. Oh no. He is considering it. She is 2 years old. She is also, clearly, going to be a very effective leader. He paused. I cannot imagine where she gets that. Signe looked at him. He looked at her. The old scar through his brow, the jaw she had memorized, the gold in his gray eyes that emerged now more easily than it used to. The Bloodstone had done something permanent to the color of him. I was nobody, she said. Not sad, just marking the distance. 9 years ago, I was nobody in an apothecary vault, and I swallowed a stone to save 600 years of other people's history. You were never nobody, he said. The same certainty he had applied to everything since the beginning. Mathematical, immovable. I know that now. She looked at the valley, at the hundreds of heartbeats she could feel through the Bloodstone when she chose to listen. Her people, their people, breathing in the warm summer evening. I was thinking about the person who didn't know it. I want to remember her. She was braver than she knew. He set down his cup and turned to her fully, and his hand came to her face. The same gesture as the vault, completed now, no hesitation. His thumb against her jaw, her scar, the line of it he had memorized as thoroughly as she had memorized him. She saved everything, he said. That vault, the stone, the bloodline. His voice dropped. She saved me from an existence I had mistaken for a life. The Bloodstone pulsed once, gently, an agreement. Inside, distantly, Lilia made a sound in her sleep, A small, questioning sound, then silence. Settling back into whatever dream occupied a 2-year-old who had strong opinions about beards and black bread and the general organization of the known world. Signe turned her face into his hand. "I am glad I stayed," she said. "In the vault. I am glad I did not run." He pressed his lips to her temple, held them there. When he spoke, it was quiet enough that only the mountain could hear it. "So am I," he said. "Every day. So am I."